My own experience is that about 50 years ago, I went to the mission field, and I'm so old I went by boat from New York to Cape Town, 18 days on the water. You can now go in 18 hours, but it took us 18 days, and I don't sail well, so unfortunately, well, I should say fortunately, I was only seasick one time, but unfortunately it lasted for 18 days. So I lived and worked in Zambia and Zimbabwe most of the 1960s, in the heyday of colonialism. Then during the 1970s I went for missionary training. Now I don't recommend doing it this way. I actually recommend doing the training first and then doing the missionary service. I think those of you who are medical people, you know that if you just simply put up a fake plaque on the wall and let people under the impression that you were trained, the government might get after you. But in missionary work, that doesn't seem to matter. We just do it anyway. So I went to Fuller, I studied there for 2 years, and then I got stuck in the machinery and worked there for 6 years as an administrator when the original faculty was there. Doctors McGavran, Tippett, Winter, Wagner, Kraft, Glasser, Edwin Orr, R. Pierce Beaver, all of those people. Imagine going to work every day and having to work with a crowd like that. 1983, I began the seminars and consultations related to dependency and self-reliance, and I've done them all over the place. Most recently, I did 4 sessions in Russia. For my book, this book has been translated into Russian, and I went there for the launch of it. It's already out of print in Russian. I went for the launch of a book which is out of print. How about that? The fastest way to get into the second printing of a book is to make a very short first printing, which is what they did. But we're already at the point where we need to print more of them. Our old professor used to say, you can't understand missiology apart from biography. In other words, if you know what I lived through in the colonial period in Central Africa, it will help you to understand why I'm passionate about some things today. While there are other things, however important they might be, I leave them to other people. But my biography informs my missiology. Dependency in the Christian mission activity. I have a beginning observation. The road to dependency is paved with good intentions. Well-meaning people are going out, sometimes in small groups, sometimes as individuals, sometimes as agencies, with the best of intentions, but they don't realize that they're turning the world into receivers. What did Jesus say? It's better to give than to receive. Sometimes I get the feeling that we are reserving the right to give to ourselves, and we won't be happy until we have turned the whole world into being receivers, and they will be getting second best while we get first best. Let me make a suggestion. Why don't we try to figure out a way to go around the world encouraging other people to become givers so they begin to get first best? The question I get more than any other, and the one that Ray asked me to address, is what should we do with all the money we have? When you ask that question, you're beginning with a donor-driven mentality. We have money that we have to give away, and we will do it even if it creates unhealthy dependency or maybe destroys someone else's dignity. Anyway, the best of intentions. By the way, let me say a word about dependency. The kind of dependency I'm talking about is the kind in which people are, we're doing for other people what they could do or should do for themselves. I'll say that a little bit later on. But some time ago, I was invited to address the board of directors in Southern California. It had about 350 people on staff, and the board members learned about me, invited me to come and address the board. Then they went to the executive director and told her that we have invited Glenn Schwartz to come and address our board. And she said, what's he going to talk about? And they told her he's going to talk about dependency. And she said, it is not necessary to bring him. We have 350 people, and none of them are on drugs and alcohol. We don't need any lecture on dependency. That was her understanding of dependency. Unfortunately, well, unhealthy dependency results from doing for people what they could or should do for themselves. That is, if dignity and self-respect are identified and preserved. I talk a lot about dignity and self-respect. I have two objectives for what I'm going to say now in the next few minutes. I'd like to show that unhealthy dependency can be avoided from the very beginning. It isn't necessary. And I'll tell stories. I don't know how many of them I have included in here tonight, but I tell stories about places where dependency did not develop because those who spread the gospel or built the hospital or built the clinic or whatever knew enough to do it in a way that did not create dependency. But the second thing is to show that unhealthy dependency can be overcome where it exists. In other words, to use your language, it's not a terminal illness. Churches don't need to die from it, although some have. But there is a cure. Now the medicine might not taste that good, but for those who are willing to identify it and take the appropriate steps, take the right medicine, it can be overcome. And I will tell some stories about that too. Have a beginning caution. Be careful not to assume that people have nothing to give back to God. I talk a lot about assumptions because the assumptions that we begin with will determine where we end up. If you think of these roundabouts in traffic where you get in and you go around and then you choose the exit you want to go off, there isn't very much difference between exit 3 and exit 4, but there's a big difference as to which one you take because later on, exit 3 you will end up way over here, and exit 4 you will end up way over there. So these assumptions that we make, they're like little self-fulfilling prophecies which determine the outcome just because of the assumptions that we make. Take, for example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, I have my Bible here, but in the interest of time, I will just tell you without turning to it, but the Apostle Paul was writing a letter to the Corinthians about the Macedonians. And you know what he was doing. He was taking a collection among the Macedonians to send to the mother church in Jerusalem that was having a drought problem. This was money going from one of the mission churches that Paul had planted back to the mother church. I cannot find any place in the New Testament where money goes from the mother churches to the mission field. By the way, if you get the feeling that I'm turning things a little bit upside down, that's actually what's happening. But by the way, it is biblical. Maybe you know of some place in the New Testament where the mother church sent money to the mission field, but I can't find it. But Paul was actively taking collections on the mission field to give to the mother church. Now there are a few places where those mother churches sent money to support the missionary. But what was Paul's attitude toward that? He didn't even like it. He said, I don't want anyone to support me. I would rather die than have someone give it to me. Why did he say that? Have you ever looked at the rationale behind Paul's statement? He was actually talking about these people who preach the gospel and get paid for it. And he referred to them as hucksters. In the English language, the word huckster means a person who goes around selling things maybe off the back of a wagon or something like that and getting money for what they sell. And there were people preaching the gospel and demanding to be paid for it, and he didn't want to have anything to do with it. So he didn't even like getting money from the mother churches for that reason. Obviously, he was going to people who had money in order to take the collection. You would guess. Not so. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 says, those Macedonians were in severe trial and extreme poverty. And that's where Paul went to take a collection among people who are in extreme, severe trial and extreme poverty. He says of them that they begged for the privilege of giving. They were beggars. But what were they begging for? They were begging for the privilege of giving. The assumptions with which we begin, and Paul assumed that it was good for these people to do what they did. There's much more in that chapter. I don't have time to go into it now. There's a whole issue of accountability. How will the money get from Macedonia to Jerusalem? You must have more than one person looking after the money, so they assign Titus and so on like that. But I won't go into that further at this point. What about overcoming dependency where it already exists? I want to tell you a story, very briefly, about a church of unemployed women and children in South Africa. They were so poor that every year their senior minister, a man by the name of Reverend Nicholas Bangu, came to America to get money for his poor church. And once while he was here, God spoke to him and said, "Don't get money from these people here in America. Go back home and get the money from your own people." And he said, "But Lord, in my church, all I have are unemployed women and children. Is that where you expect me to get the money?" And the Lord said, "Yes." How many of you have actually thought that the ideal place to take a collection is among unemployed women and children? There are no hands? I'm disappointed because that's how I raise my support when people raise hands. And Well, the Lord said to him, "Go to unemployed women and children to get the money." Maybe I'll get a few hands later on, okay? So he said to the Lord, "I will do it, but you will have to show me how." And so the Lord said to him, "Go home and teach those women how to care for their families. Teach them how to evangelize their husbands. Teach them how to make something with their hands so they can earn a living. And teach them to give something back to God in thanksgiving. In other words, teach them to tithe." So Reverend Bangu did this. He went home and he did all four of these things. There are now men in those churches. I have seen the men. He taught them if they make 10 dresses to sell, one of them belongs to the Lord, it's not theirs. They make 20 baskets, 2 belong to the Lord, it's not theirs. This church, known as the Black Assemblies of God in South Africa, and Ms. Momalo was here tonight, she knows this church. But this church has a conference in a place called Havanchu. Every year they go there for a conference, and the last time that I know that they went to that conference, they took a collection of over 15 million South African rand in one collection, and at an exchange rate of 7 to the dollar, that is more than $2 million US in the collection from a church of unemployed women and children. How many of you think a good place to take a collection is among unemployed women and children? Hey, another few hands, I should have my camera. It was these 4 spiritual principles that made it possible. Let me ask you a question. If he had kept on trying to get money in North America, how long would it have taken for that church to get to the point where they could put $2 million in the collection on one weekend? Not even a week-long conference, a weekend. I maintain he could have collected money from that time until now and well into the future, and it wouldn't have happened. It isn't the money coming in from the outside that changes the paradigm on which people function. It's 4 spiritual principles behind the event, like are mentioned here.